Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In our previous lesson, I was talking about pins, how to create or use pins. And I'd like to continue with that topic because it's one of the most important tactics in chess. Let's get started with our very first example. Here we go. In this position, we can see that there is a complete material balance, each side having a bishop, a knight, and 6 pawns for each side. Here the important aspect is that the two bishops are on the same diagonal with a black pawn in between them. The other important element is that black's bishop at the moment is on an unprotected square. But why would that be important when no white piece can capture it at the moment? Well, the reason why it is because white can use a pin. The way that would happen, that if that pawn from f5 would need to move away, then indeed black's bishop would be in danger. Well, with all these hints, hopefully you got the idea what white's supposed to do, namely simply grab the pawn on g4. If black does not capture white's knight with the pawn, then white simply has won a pawn. And if they do, white still would have ended up winning a pawn and trading his knight for black's bishop. In this position, our challenge was how to win material. And what we did, we accomplished that goal by winning a pawn with knight takes g4. If, on the other hand, if it was black's turn in this position, black would have had the time to protect himself. Can you think of a move that would save this pawn on g4? Well, what could be the methods to try to accomplish that? One way would be to try to move away the bishop out of the pin. However, the problem with that would be that then the pawn on f5 would not be protected sufficiently. Another way could be if black could protect the bishop on g6. But as we know, pawns don't move backwards, and therefore it's not possible at the moment. The only way black could and should protect the pawn if it was black's turn is to push the pawn up to h5 right now, protecting black's pawn on g4. But in our example, it was white's turn and knight g4 wins a pawn. Let's move on to our second example of this lesson. Here we go. In this position, black has not castled yet, but on the other hand, they have the material advantage. Each side has a pair of rooks on the c-file. Each side has a knight. However, black has a rook versus white's bishop. And of course, each side has a queen and 6 pawns. At this moment, white has a number of good-looking moves, but actually only one of them does the job. For example, moving the knight to the center to e5, creating a fork over black's queen and rook, would not be a good idea because the black queen would not need to move away, as black can make an intermediate move, capturing white's rook with a check, and then white is in serious trouble because of the weakness of the back rank. In fact, white has no better choice than block that check with the queen, which would result in losing the queen, after which the black queen will be free to run away and have a completely winning position. The same problem would happen if the white bishop would choose to move to b5, trying to create a pin. The problem again is that after the black rook moves away, white does not have the time to capture black's queen because the white king is in check. And therefore, after that, for example, if the knight comes back, black could either retreat the rook to c6 or, even better, capture white's knight with another check, and when queen takes back, then capture the bishop on b5, and as you can see, black now has an extra rook and knight, which is a tremendous material advantage. Going back again to our starting position, we have discovered that two of the most natural moves would be big mistake, both for the same reason that the white rook right now on c1 is under attack. What white should do here is trade a pair of rooks on c6. Now, black's best choice is to actually castle and live with the loss of material, which would leave white with an extra bishop. But why shouldn't black simply capture the white rook back? The reason for that is that that would result in the black king and queen being on the same diagonal, allowing white to create a very powerful and effective pin by playing bishop b5. Importantly, the bishop is protected by white's queen, and the black queen cannot run away, no piece can come in between obviously, and if queen takes bishop, of course queen takes, leaving white with significant material gain. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, it is black's turn. The question is, what should black do? First of all, the material balance is even, each side having a queen, a rook, and 6 pawns. Now this is a tricky situation where the question is it a good idea for black to capture the pawn that was hanging on c4? Since the black pawn protects that rook, it seems safe to do that. However, this is a trick that white has set up on purpose. Again, similarly to our very first example in this lesson, black's problem now is that the queen on d7 is on an unprotected square. If you still remember the pattern we used in the first example, you realize that white should now capture the black rook, winning a rook, and if pawn chooses to take the white queen, rook will take the black queen, and white is significantly ahead again. Therefore, in our starting position, rook takes pawn would be a big mistake. Much better is, for example, advancing the pawn out of harm's way. Let's move on to the following position. Here we are. In this position, it is white's turn again. Let's look at the material count first. White has 2 rooks versus black's rook and bishop. We first typically start counting with the most valuable pieces. That means that between those valuable pieces, white is up 2 points, the rook versus the bishop. On the other hand, on the pawn count, black is up by 1. So therefore, white is up by 1 point. The next thing to look at is, what is our opponent's threat? So assuming you're playing with the white pieces, the question you should ask yourself in this position and typically in any position after each move of your opponent, what does my opponent want to do? And in this case, that answer should be that my opponent wants to grab the pawn on h2 because both the black bishop and the black rook are targeting that pawn, and white only has his king protecting it. So the first thing we could think of? Well, what about simply putting a pawn in between the black bishop and our pawn, attacking that bishop right away at the same go? However, that would be a mistake because black could use the pin existing over the white pawn on h2. The black bishop could safely capture the pawn on g3 as the pawn is unable to capture the bishop right now because it would leave white's king under attack. Now, in addition to the pin example we saw already in this position, there is another pin that white can use. Namely, just like in our last example, black has an unprotected piece on h5, the rook, and therefore the white rook is able to capture the black bishop. If now pawn takes rook, simply rook takes rook, and white won the bishop. That's the correct move for white. Rook takes bishop. If after rook takes bishop, black would try to play a6, then white has a number of good ways to go. The simplest one is to simply maintain the pin along the fifth rank. So after pawn would take the white rook on f4, again the white rook would be able to capture the black rook on h5. Although I have to say that even rook takes pawn would be a good idea. A bit trickier, but works. Check. In the meantime, the black king needs to move out of the check. And then the two rooks can connect, for example, with rook f4 to f6. And now the rook on f6 protects the other rook. And white has an extra rook. Let's move on to our fifth example in this lesson. Here we go. Let's again try to do the material count. We can tell that white has an extra queen, against which black has an extra rook, bishop, and 2 pawns. That equals to 5 plus 3, 8 plus 2, 10, meaning that black has theoretically a small material advantage by 1 point. The white queen is under attack at the moment, and if white makes the correct move, can force black into a pin and after that immediately win material. The tricky and correct move is to move the queen to c3 check. King can only move to g8, and now as we can see there is a pin situation along the g file, allowing white to simply grab the bishop on f3 because pawn cannot capture because it would leave the king in check. A very nice trick. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this endgame, there is a complete material balance. Right now, black has just blocked a check by moving the bishop to e5, offering the exchange of bishops. This position looks pretty even for a first glance. However, white has a very powerful move right now that guarantees white to win a bishop. Can you think of what that move may be? White obviously cannot use the pin by advancing the pawn because the bishop will simply capture our bishop. That would certainly not be a good idea. Here, white has a very powerful move by moving his rook to f4. White is simply using the pin to give a check. But in reality, white achieves a lot more than that with this powerful check. Since the black king is attacked, it needs to move away, and what that means is that after the king moves away from its current position, it will no longer protect the bishop on e5. Even after the trickiest looking move, king g5, which attacks white's rook, after bishop takes bishop, the bishop from e5 protects the rook, and therefore white simply has won a bishop. If you wonder what should white do after rook d5, which would attack the bishop, well, certainly do not move away on the long diagonal, but either move on the other diagonal or move the rook simply to e4, protecting the bishop, and be home safe with an extra bishop. There are special situations where we can use a pin even to checkmate, and I'd like to show you some of those examples right now. Here we go. In this endgame, white has a rook versus black's bishop and pawn. So white is only 1 point ahead. But you have to be really careful when there is very little material left on the board, and especially when you do not have any pawns. Oftentimes, such a material advantage is not sufficient to win the game. Just like here, if white doesn't find how to checkmate right away, for example, simply moves away the knight from the attack, the material balance would pretty much guarantee a draw for black, even not considering the fact that black right away could give a check and then after the king moves away capture white's rook. But even if this tactical motive was not there, black should be pretty solid and save the game with correct play. Therefore, it is essential for white to find the correct move right now, which is attacking black's king right away and give a smothered mate, thanks to the pin over the h7 pawn. It's important to always recognize where the pinned pieces are, if there are any in the position. It doesn't necessarily mean that each time there is a way to take advantage of that immediately. However, nevertheless, you definitely want to be aware of it, and if there is one, you'd want to look around and see if you can win material or even find a way to checkmate. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Well, this is a tricky one. Again, the first thing to notice is what is the material balance? Well, if you do the count, you'll agree with me that there is a complete material balance. The second thing you want to notice is what does your opponent, let's say black in this case, want to do? Well, hopefully you'll notice that there is a double attack on the bishop on g4, and the fact that this bishop on g4 is actually pinned, meaning it cannot run away from the attack, because the king then would be left under attack. So what should white do? Should white simply protect the bishop? Well, that certainly is an option, although not the best one by any means. Before you settle for pure defense, always look around, see if you can do better. See if your opponent maybe missed something. Now, here the important situation is that not only that white has a pinned bishop along the g-file, but also black has a pinned bishop along this diagonal, which allows white to checkmate right away. Can you find that move? And the answer is moving the rook up to e8, attacking black's king. Because of the pin over the bishop on d7, the bishop cannot capture the rook, and black basically got a back rank checkmate. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. Again, let's establish who is ahead. Well, if you look carefully, you'll see each side having a queen, a rook, a dark squared bishop. You'll notice that black has an extra bishop, while white only has an extra pawn. The next thing to look for is, what does black want to do? Try to look for that. It's a very serious threat that you need to be aware of. And that threat is to checkmate the white king. When there is a battery set up, like you see here between the black bishop and the black queen on the same diagonal, a threat of moving the queen near the white king is absolutely a devastating threat. Again, it's important not just to think about defense, but see if you can arrive first or you can give a checkmate first, which certainly is the case here. Right now, white can use the pin. Again, important to recognize where is the pin, which is the pinned piece. And that pinned piece is black's bishop on g7, which allows white to checkmate right away by capturing the pawn on h6. Beautiful checkmate. Let's move on to the next example, which is a very typical one. And even pretty strong players once in a while forget about this pattern, this idea. Of course, typically not when they get here, but a couple of moves earlier when one side prepares this and makes a forced series of moves resulting in this idea. Right now, the pinned piece is the pawn on f2. That pawn cannot advance or cannot potentially capture on g3. And that's exactly what black can take advantage of. The black queen is ready to move to g3, capture the pawn, attack white's king right away, thanks to the fact that there is a pin along the diagonal of the bishop. Now white has no other choice but moving out of the check, and now black can easily checkmate with the queen. A very important pattern that I suggest you remember, as it can bring you many nice victories in your own games. Let's see the next example. Here we go. Who is ahead in this position? Well, if you do your quick counting, you'll see that the white has an extra knight and an extra pawn. Luckily for black, it is their turn. Since you know that this is a lesson about pins, try to figure out where is the pinned piece for white. And that piece is the bishop on d2. Again, it means that that bishop cannot move on this diagonal. Can you figure out what black's move should be to win the game? Well, it is to take advantage of the fact that the bishop is stuck to where it is, and therefore the queen can safely capture the knight on c3. Check. King has to move, and black not only won a knight, but immediately is ready to checkmate. And here comes our final example. Here we go. In this position, it's quite visible that white has significant material advantage. In addition, we need to notice that the black rook is under attack. Now, when your opponent attacks one of your pieces, it's very important to recognize that it is under attack. However, just like when you're getting a check, don't immediately touch the attacked piece. Look around, see if you have a better move, such as blocking the attack or capturing the attacking piece, or if it's not an attack on your king, see if you can make an intermediate move and follow up with your own attack, ignoring the threat to your piece. Of course, you want to make sure that your attack will work and you will not lose your piece that's being attacked. In this case, black has a very powerful move using a pin, and again, always be aware of which pieces, if any, that are pinned. In this case, it's the pawn on a2. Because of the fact that that pawn is pinned, black is able to move his knight to b3, checking white's king. White has no choice but moving the king to b1. Now, if black would not have at his disposal the move that they do, In that case, this knight check that we just gave would not have been a good idea, because now the white king is out of the pin, therefore the knight is under attack, and so remains the black rook in the corner. Luckily for black, in fact, it's not luck, because black on purpose gave this check because they foresaw the fact that the black bishop now can come to d3, checkmating white's king. Very nice example. Well, I hope I gave you some more ideas and showed you more patterns of pins that you can use in your own games. Good luck. Keep looking out for the pins in your own games when you play. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.